Chapter 6: 5 Ways of Recovering from the Abuse. There is a proven strategy that helps with practicing compassion. This strategy has 5 components, which are: number 1, self-understanding; number 2, self-forgiveness; number 3, self-kindness; number 4, self-encouragement; and number 5, self-acceptance. This strategy is designed to teach victims of child abuse about the following attitudes and skills: how to view your symptoms and negative ways of coping, how to forgive yourself for the harm you have caused to yourself or others, how to understand the negative power of self-criticism and focus on yourself, how to have inner strength and warmth against self-attacking thoughts, how to substitute self-criticism with self-kindness, how to have compassionate feelings for yourself, and how to soothe yourself in positive ways, how to know about your strengths and work on them, how to appreciate yourself, and how to practice accountability instead of criticizing yourself. The amount of shame the victims of child abuse go through makes it impossible for them to practice self-kindness unless or until they decrease the amount of shame they carry. This is because these victims believe that they don't deserve self-kindness. To practice self-kindness, victims need to practice 3 components: self-understanding, self-acceptance, and self-forgiveness. Self-understanding. It is one of the essential components of the strategy we are studying. By gaining self-understanding, you will relieve yourself of the burden and shame you are carrying due to abuse. Without self-understanding, it will be nearly impossible for you to practice the other 4 components. Like many victims, you may be overwhelmed by the shame of being abused, and that shame you have to carry due to self-harming behavior. This shame can interfere with your ability to be self-compassionate. Self-understanding can be the key that will help you open the doors to self-compassion. Victims tend to continue harming themselves without self-understanding and letting themselves feel down for their mistakes and shortcomings. Victims who are abused in their childhood are very hard on themselves. They set high expectations for themselves and try to achieve them. They make many mistakes that further cause them to have no mercy on themselves and have no excuse policy for their behavior. This situation is unfortunate, as you don't allow yourself to acknowledge the pain and sufferings, and you expect yourself to walk away from abuse unscathed. The fortunate thing is that you may be aware of how trauma has affected you. For comparison, let's say you were in a plane crash and you survived it. Your physical injuries are now healed, but the events during the impact you had to go through are traumatic. The realization that your life was in danger and the fear of what would happen was horrible. The terror of pain, overwhelming sights and sounds are itself very traumatic. Even though you survived, you still have to take this trauma with you. You will replay the crash over and over. You will experience nightmares for quite some time. The same is the case of child abuse victims. In addition to the shame, they have to carry the trauma and stress of these memories. And this stress and trauma take a toll on the victim. I have often found myself explaining to clients that I have actually never met a victim of childhood abuse who didn't react to the abuse with problematic behaviors, abusing alcohol or drugs, acting out, sexual or other addictions, self-harm, abusive behavior toward loved ones, or a pattern of staying in abusive relationships. Throughout this chapter, I aim to encourage you to connect with your past and current behavior and the traumatic experiences. This will help you be compassionate with yourself. Post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a severe anxiety disorder that develops after extremely traumatic events. This can be severe injury or being in life-threatening situations. This can also be from the violent assault that damages personal pride and integrity. People diagnosed with PTSD have nightmares and flashbacks of the traumatic events. They have difficulty sleeping and they feel detached and estranged. To make matters worse, PTSD often occurs with related disorders such as substance abuse, depression, and the problem of memory and cognition. In some cases of PTSD, symptoms become more debilitating than trauma. PTSD further impairs the person's ability to function socially and in family life, including troubled marital life, family discord, difficulty in parenting, and occupational difficulties. Those people who are diagnosed with PTSD are vulnerable to repeating cycle of violence due to the following reasons. Number 1, many people diagnosed with PTSD turn to drugs and alcohol to get relief from their symptoms. Number 2, some people may develop abusive behaviors and may have trouble controlling their anger. And number 3, some victims may develop victim-like behavior. They may indulge in self-blame, feel helpless, and have a sense of being tainted or evil. Complex trauma. Children who have suffered from multiple chronic traumas suffer from unusual set-off symptoms that can differ from the symptoms of PTSD. These children tend to suffer from serious interpersonal, functional, and behavioral problems. This is known as complex trauma. This particular group has high rates of depression, drug and substance abuse, personality disorders, and anxiety stress disorders. Unless victims don't overcome these adverse effects of trauma, they may continue to experience this throughout their lives. Victims of complex trauma tend to experience extreme behaviors such as self-injury, cutting, and headbanging, sexual acting out, getting into high-risk and painful situations, sudden and repeated outbursts of anger, extreme behaviors such as cutting and headbanging, severe sexual acting out, addictions to illicit sex or pornography, reenacting sexual trauma, creating high-risk or painful situations to counteract feeling numb or dead inside, self-harming behaviors, sudden outbursts of anger, suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, extreme risk-taking behavior, reenacting unhealthy relationships. Trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed. The expressions trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed allude to more supportive, caring, and compassionate ways of seeing the behaviors of victims who have been damaged or traumatized. The trauma-sensitive methodology challenges how we look and perceive trauma victims. helping and empowering them to treat themselves and be treated by experts with greater poise, regard, and sympathy than they normally do. The term trauma-informed suggests that the victims and helpers are both trained in the consequences of trauma. By treating yourself in trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed ways, you can easily increase your ability to be more compassionate. This helps you to be more empathetic and empowers you to deal with your symptoms. These are some of the principles of the trauma-informed way of thinking below. Trauma restricts the victim's choice and disturbs life. It undermines self-esteem and creates a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Behavioral problems are adaptive responses to trauma. They should be viewed as an attempt to cope with past trauma. Substance use may have evolved as a coping strategy when options were limited. The focus should be on what happens to the victims rather than what was wrong with them. Victims are doing the best of their capacity to cope with the life-altering and life-shattering effects of trauma. Instead of blaming yourself for the efforts you are putting in to manage your trauma reactions, you can start to recognize the adaptive function of your symptoms. For example, you are consuming alcohol and other drugs to cope with anxiety. You can begin to recognize this and have compassion for yourself. This is a significant change and step forward. The benefits of trauma-informed thinking include: it helps you transform from being bad to being hurt. This opens a door for a more empathetic and constructive attitude towards yourself. It helps in externalizing your problems. You can view yourself as good with some issues that have intruded in your life, but they don't represent your true self. Trauma-informed helps victims show normal and reasonable reactions to the traumatic and unfortunate events. It emphasizes the resources and strengths. As victims are very self-critical, they must look for their strengths and give themselves due credit. It helps victims to look for healthy and productive strategies to cope with trauma. Connecting behavior and experience. Making the right connection between your behavior and trauma will help you be more compassionate and less judgmental, critical, impatient, and angry at your behavior. Some of the problematic behaviors are listed below. This list is not comprehensive, but it will help you understand the connection between troubled behavior and abuse. Eating disorders, self-injurious behavior, drug abuse and substance use, emotional dysregulation, deregulation. Eating disorders. Eating disorders include eating problems such as binging, overeating, and emotional eating because you were emotionally abused. These issues arise to cope with loneliness, depression, emptiness, or other forms of stress and anxiety. Self-injurious behavior. This includes behavior like cutting or self-inflicting wounds, burns, or headbanging. These are attempts to make cope with severe abuse or abuse caused by multiple perpetrators. Using substances to manage the impact of abuse. A person who has been abused emotionally, physically, and sexually has to suffer from powerful emotions and interpersonal chaos. Some victims believe and discover that they can get relief from pain by using drugs and alcohol. Depression. Many of the victims report that they feel hopeless about their life. Using drugs like cocaine help alleviate the mood for a short time for the victims who experience depression for an extended period. Anxiety. Victims of trauma feel anxious and fearful all the time. Alcohol and tranquilizers lessen the anxiety for a short term for the victim who constantly feel on edge. Inner turmoil and pain. Victims who experience nightmares and flashbacks of the traumatic events may feel that the intensity of their experience is far too great. They might seek drugs that help them to forget and tend to dull or numb sensations. These victims are at high risk of choosing opioids or alcohol to reduce the pain. The absence of all feelings. While some victims feel too much, some have reported that they are unable to feel anything. They said that they are unable to feel any sensations, from sexuality to happiness or sadness. Any substances that heighten the sensations are appealing to these victims. They may be drawn toward cocaine or amphetamines for adrenaline rush type sensations. Passivity. The long-term consequence of abuse is the lack or absence of any motivation in abuse victims. These victims are unable to stand up for themselves. They report that they see no choice but to submit to someone instead of standing up for themselves. They wish they could feel anger or assertiveness. Drugs such as PCP or alcohol appeal to these victims. Excessive anger and rage. When victims accept what was done to them at the hands of the abuser, they may have overwhelming feelings of rage and anger. If they don't have access to the abuser, they may feel angry and find no outlet for their rage. In many cases, they turn to drugs and alcohol to feel less angry. An opportunity for self-understanding. You are more prone to use drugs to cope with traumatic symptoms if you often use drugs or alcohol for recreational purposes. Try these sentence stems for the symptoms. This is an effective way and will be beneficial in the long term. Given my past associated with sexual abuse, it's normal that I try to drown out the pain somehow. Given my experiences of abuse, it's understandable that I began drinking at such a young age. Given my history of abuse, it's understandable that I drink excessively. It's reasonable that I've had a hard time quitting drinking, given my abused childhood. I recommend that you repeat the identical phrase stem as many times as necessary. I suggest you use the same sentence stems, completing the sentence as many times as you can think of responses. Grounding. Grounding is a powerful but simple and effective strategy to manage and relieve emotional pain, such as panic episodes, trauma flashbacks, and dissociating. Grounding is powerful because it can be used in any situation where you are caught in emotional pain. It can be done at any time and at any place. It is important to note that grounding is not a relaxation technique. It is a tool often used for centering victims. Some of the victims with PTSD tend to become anxious when guided through conventional methods because hearing words like relax may be a trigger that can remind them of sexual abuse. Most victims report that they feel more present after practicing grounding. Practice grounding whenever you are feeling extremely anxious. Putting your behaviors in context. The following exercise will help you in building a better self-understanding. Exercise: the connection between the abuse and your behaviors. Number 1, make a list of behaviors that causes you troubles. You can also write down what things you have done that cause the most shame. Number 2, take a close look at the list and see if you can find the connection between it and your abuse experience. Number 3, once you have the connection and know it is understandable, check whether you feel more compassion for yourself. And number 4, next time, see if you are behaving in a self-destructive way. Instead of blaming yourself, try to say to yourself, I understand why I am acting this way. Repeating the cycle of abuse. We have already discussed why abuse victims resort to coping mechanisms like substance abuse, self-harm, sexual abuse, and other dangerous addictions. This section will focus on another reason why abuse victims tend to carry such a tremendous amount of shame. This is a sad fact that no one gets through the abusive childhood experience unscathed. In many cases, those who are abused tend to become abusers as they grow up. Research reveals that those who experience abuse tend to absorb it and pass it on. Studies show that children who are abused and assaulted are at greater risk of becoming abusive toward their children when they become parents. Females who have been abused in childhood have a high chance of continued victimization even when they grow up. A sexually abused male will be likely to harm his children sexually. If he marries a woman who was sexually abused, there is a high chance she will become a silent partner. She will stand silently while her husband continuously molests their children. Battered women are often and frequently misunderstood even by those who are closest to them. In my experience of dealing with many victims, there is always a good reason, and it only has something to do with an abusive childhood. Number 1, make a list of all the reasons you cannot leave the situation or end the relationship, like a fear of being alone, or not supporting your children, or believing that your partner will commit suicide if you leave. Number 2, now go back over your upbringing to see if there are any parallels to the above-mentioned reasons. You may have documented fear of being alone because you were frequently left home as a child with no one to look after you. You may possibly show worry about not being able to look after your children since your father abandoned the family and you went through a period where you didn't have enough to eat. The fear that your spouse may commit suicide may stem from your father threatening or committing suicide when your mother left him. It is difficult for many of us, including the victims, to understand why a battered woman stays in an abusive relationship. It is even harder to understand why someone would abuse another human in such a brutal way. Sam's story, repeating what was done to him. Sam was my client in the early part of my career. He was required by law to seek counseling for abusing his wife physically. I was an intern, and at the time, I didn't completely understand why victims were used in this way. At that particular time, victims were thought to have anger management issues. Working with Sam was a gift because he gave me a deep understanding of the batter's plight. Sam was initially defensive to the point where he argued and seemed utterly closed to any help I was offering. He was convinced that he was beating his wife because she wasn't listening to him, and the only solution to the problem in his mind was for her to do everything he asked her to do. While he realized he had to stop beating her to avoid jail, he still didn't grasp the real understanding of why he shouldn't treat his wife this way. After many sessions, I realized that Sam's behavior was a great deal of shame he was trying to suppress under all of this. It took a while, but I discovered that Sam's father was severely emotionally abusive toward him in his childhood. His father always undermined him and told him he was worthless and will not achieve anything in his life. When I talked about this with Sam and how his father treated him, he tried to brush it off and said it wasn't a big deal and it was for his own good. I was determined to help Sam, and I wanted Sam to be compassionate toward himself. I told him that his father didn't have any right to talk to him in this way. I told him that it was a bad situation that he had to go through. I politely told him that it was very mean of his father to attack his character. At first, Sam argued and told me that he needed it when he wasn't good enough and said it made him strong. He told me that his father was trying to make him more responsible. Over the next few months, Sam began to see the emotional abuse he had to endure from his father. He felt ashamed and humiliated. I continued to offer him compassion, and eventually, Sam started to realize that perhaps his father was way too hard on him. The next stage was to help and encourage Sam to have compassion for himself. He began to recognize that he had been, after all, just a little boy, and that his father's expectations were too high. He was able to get to the point to tell me that he didn't feel like a screw-up for the first time in his life. By gaining self-understanding and connecting with his own suffering, Sam could have true and honest compassion for his wife's abuse. By the time Sam left the program, I was no longer worried about him abusing his wife again. But of course, I couldn't be sure. About 6 months later, Sam sent me this letter. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the work you did with me. No one in my life has ever understood me the way you did, and no one has been so kind. You helped me to feel that maybe I could be kind to myself. I learned so much from you. Mostly, I realized that I didn't want to treat my wife and kids the way I was treated. P.S. My wife wants me to thank you, too. If you have become an abuser or abusive to anyone close, I hope the story of Sam will aid you into remembering that there is always a reason someone becomes an abuser. In fact, I have never known an abuser who wasn't abused in any way. However, it's just an explanation, not an excuse. The following solution will help you see clearly how your current behavior represents your parents' or abuser's behavior. What do you and your parents have in common? For this, you will need 3 or 4 pieces of paper. Number 1. On one piece of paper, write how your parents neglected you or were abusive toward you. This includes attitudes or verbal abuse. On the second paper, write down ways other adults or your relatives abused you. Number 3. On another paper, write the ways you were neglectful or abusive toward your children. This list does not need to be read by anybody else. Making this list will be no doubt very painful, and you may try to lie to yourself. To break your shame while writing, take deep breaths and write again. Remember, you are doing this to get better. And number 4, compare the list you made. Note the similarities in how you have been abusive or neglectful toward your children, partner, or others. The lesser known consequences of abuse and neglect. There are also other subtle legacies of abuse and neglect. For instance, those with a history of abuse can often clearly see their children, partners, close relationships, or coworkers. They see them through the lens of fear, anger, distrust, and pain. They see signs of abandonment, betrayal, and rejection, even though it's not there. Those who have been subject to abuse and neglect in the past are often unable to trust their partners. They also have issues with anger management. They also have high expectations from their children and don't want to see them make any mistakes. Practicing self-understanding. Although some people are more resilient than others, the damage they have faced from the abuse has long-term consequences. In this dilemma, gaining self-understanding will help you. It will stop you from adding more shame to your overwhelmed condition, and it will also act as a fuel to motivate you to change, grow, and get better. It will also help you to stop being self-judgmental.